So this video is about assessment of and for learning at Lycoming College in the spring of 2021. In traditional models of education, we tend to think of what has become known as the banking model of education, where a teacher can stand in the front of the room and lecture, and they just fill students' heads with knowledge, just like pouring gasoline into an empty container, as this cartoon shows. And as Paulo Freire said in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this really isn't how students learn, and it's just not a helpful way to think about education. So instead of thinking of filling students' heads as if they are empty vessels waiting to be filled, there are many other ways of thinking of learning. And Grant Wiggins, who is a big name in instructional design, argues that learners need endless feedback more than they need endless teaching. In current models of education, which better fits with what we know about the psychology of learning, education is more of a dialogue between the professor and the learners, and of course between the learners themselves and the learners in the world. And the feedback and assessment can allow us to see behind the scenes of their learning, to make what is happening in their heads visible, when traditionally it has been invisible. So there are many purposes for assessment. So some of the main ones are because administrators ask for it, including administrators telling us we need to do assessment for accreditation this spring. Assessment can be to hold students accountable for the things that we ask them to do in class. They can be pre-assessments for assignment design, for example, asking students what they already know about a topic and then adjusting your instruction based on those results. Assessments can show results and value of your efforts as an instructor or as in a department. Assessment can be for improvement, either immediate improvement right there on the spot in the classroom or improvement over time as an educator or as a curriculum. Assessment can help us think like a student because we are no longer 18 to 22 years old anymore, and many of us were never very much like the typical student. And there are many other reasons to conduct assessments that are not included here, but these are just some of the main ones. The point is that there are a lot of reasons for conducting assessment, and your reason for doing it will shape what you do. It's important to remember that any one particular assessment doesn't tell the whole story. Each type of assessment has its benefits and its drawbacks, and it is as we put together various assessments that we start to see a more holistic picture. Just like in a mosaic, any one particular tile doesn't look like much, but when you put them together, they tell a very different story. So there are multiple types of assessment. Effective assessments are ones that focus on how students feel about the classroom. We shouldn't stop at effective assessments. This also can include what they think that they have learned, but motivation and attention and other affective aspects of learning lay the groundwork for the cognitive aspects of learning. It can be really important to ask, how's your motivation? During the time of COVID, it can also be important to say, what else is going on that might affect the classroom? And that can help you design your lessons and class time to meet their needs during this time of trauma and distraction. Cognitive assessments are what students can do and what they have learned based on instruction. And there's a third kind that is behavioral, so if you want students to do something, there are ways to assess that they are actually doing that thing. I have not spent as much time learning about behavioral assessments as affective or cognitive, so the rest of this presentation will focus more on the first two. But keep it in mind, if you realize your students are not doing something that you want them to do, you can design lessons and assessments to test behaviors as well. So it's also important to discuss the difference between formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments are in the process of learning assessments. You can think of them as guideposts along the way, or tasting the soup in the kitchen before you serve it to company during a dinner party. Formative assessments make student thinking or learning visible in time for you to respond to it. Formative assessments can benefit current students and not wait until future students benefit from what you've learned from past students. And it's important to realize that formative assessments may or may not leave documentation that you can show outside of the class. In contrast, summative assessments are at the end of learning. They are the term paper. They are the test. They test the destination of student learning. They can demonstrate results and value of your instructional efforts. They are the full meal rather than a bite-sized snack. So I'm going to focus more on formative assessment in a good part of this presentation because I think it's really valuable, and I think that we do a lot more of it than we give ourselves credit for. And this may be important as we approach the middle states interviews to bring up the things that we do in the classroom that we may not recognize as assessment. I've co-written a book called Snapshots of Reality about bringing formative assessment into library instruction, which is also valuable for instructors looking for formative assessments based on helping students with research papers. And in that book, I and my co-authors wrote, "Formative assessment allows an instructor to view or have access to knowledge that otherwise may be hidden within the student." Another thing that I like to say or think about with formative assessment is that formative assessment is active learning with a point. So in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a lot of talk about getting more active learning in the classroom, getting students to do something. And at least in the library literature, sometimes they describe activities without ever saying what those activities demonstrated to the instructor. So formative assessment activities are often the kinds of active learning activities you give with your students anyway, but you design them so that in the process of doing those activities, students demonstrate what is going on in their heads, what they're learning, what they can do, and then you can react to that, whether it's on the spot in a particular class or reacting to it at the next class or the next week. Some key characteristics of formative assessment are active learning. You can't just lecture. Students have to do something to show what they can do, what they've learned, how they're feeling about their learning, that kind of thing. Moratoriums. The specific term moratorium is something that I pulled from game-based learning, but it is a term to describe a safe place to practice. So most formative assessment activities are low stakes. They're either not graded or the grade that they have doesn't really affect their overall grade. So students can learn from failure, which is really, really important, and they need room to learn from failure as they start to get more competent in a particular skill or things that they need to know. And in that practicing, they can work their way up to being held accountable in higher stakes assessments. Formative assessment also involves scaffolding, which is tied to this idea of moratoriums, that you ask them to do something with help, either help from each other or help from you, and then slowly you remove those supports as they gain competence and work towards those higher stakes assessments. Formative assessment, because students get feedback from you and confirmation that they're on the right track, can be very, very important for motivation, because students are going to be less afraid that they're spending a lot of energy only to realize at the end that they were not on the right track from the beginning. And oftentimes these formative assessments do not feel like assessments to students. So discussions or some of the activities we'll talk about here in a few minutes, they feel like back and forth with the instructor, back and forth with other students. They don't feel like a test. And I put a bunch of stars after this last one that feedback is a key part of formative assessment, that students are getting feedback on what they learn and what they know in their demonstrations of their developing competence, and they are corrected along the road so that they know whether or not they're on the right track. So formative assessment can be known by other names. One is Assessment4Learning as opposed to Assessment of Learning. It promotes learning in the process of learning, and also classroom assessment techniques, which is the title of what is probably the Bible of formative assessment for higher education by Angelo and Cross. And this is a book that we have in the teaching collection in the Snowden Library if you want to look at it. So it has a nice section in the beginning to talk about the theory and foundations of formative assessments, or they call them classroom assessment techniques. And then they have 50 examples of assessment technique activities that work for college classrooms. So to give you some examples of what these activities look like, I've separated them before instruction, during instruction, after instruction. I come at this from teaching one-shots in the library world. You may not see such an important distinction between these, but it also may help you determine which ones are most appropriate for your various instruction and assessment needs. So one example is a pretest or a survey. This is something that sometimes I do, particularly with an English composition class, where I assess students before they've had any library instruction to see what they know. What did they do in high school? What did they do in their first semester as far as research? What do they know about the resources that we have at the library? And then I show them those results and we go over the ones where most of them didn't have the right answer. Another example is brainstorming. So it could be brainstorming what they already know or brainstorming their topic ideas. So this is something that I do in Sarah Holstein's Psych Methods course, where students spend an hour in class with a partner brainstorming what topics they might like to do for their semester-long project. That makes the student thinking visible so that Sarah can walk around and talk about what she has seen work in the past, what they have the equipment for, and that kind of thing. Crystal ball or wish list. Sometimes there may be a flexible time in your class, a workshop scheduled, or maybe a turning point in the class where you start the class by saying, what do you guys want to do today? How can I support you, or how can we use this class time to support launching into the rest of the class? Predicting is something that James Lang talks about in his Small Teaching book, which is a really fabulous book, that they've done a lot of research in the field of psychology and show that having students predict what is true or what they're going to learn in a class in a particular day, whether or not they're right, improves their learning. And so you can have students answer a question, how do you think this works in this field? And whether or not that they are right, it sets the platform for having that material in that class that day stick better. You can spend some time activating background knowledge, getting them to brainstorm what they already know about a topic, having a discussion with what they're bringing into the classroom at the beginning of a class, and kind of get a better idea of where they're at, as well as priming their background knowledge so that they can start sticking the new knowledge to what they already know, which is a foundation of learning. Justin Medina has been using a program called Perusal for group readings. So anytime students have to read part of a textbook or something that they all have to read before class, they have this platform where they can annotate the readings ahead of time, and the instructor can see what kinds of questions they're asking, what kinds of things they're bringing up in Perusal, and use that information to guide the classroom discussion. And I know Andrew Stafford was talking about using Flipgrid videos, so outside of class, students creating short videos, which may be before or after instruction, but in some way demonstrates where they're at in their learning process. So during instruction, this can be a lot of different things. This can be a reflection, so asking students to respond to a reflection prompt for a few minutes and then reading over those and responding to them at the next class. You could use Poll Everywhere or other clicker software to poll students or ask students to answer multiple choice or short answer questions. You can have students draw their understanding of a concept, which you can process pretty quickly by walking around the room. You can give students a paragraph and have them check or underline the sentences that require a citation. Again, you can have students brainstorm research topics in class or out of class. Homework, when there is some kind of feedback, is a good example of formative assessment that many of you guys already do. Low stakes quizzes, and so that low stakes is important. So I use reading quizzes to hold students accountable for doing the readings. They're pretty easy there. The things that I test them on are the things that I think are the biggest ideas in those readings. I often have a few extra credit points built in so that if they miss one question, it doesn't hurt them. And in fact, doing the readings in that way can help them overall. If they accumulate extra credit points, they can apply those points towards other assignments. Another example is guided practice templates. So I know one professor was seeing students struggle to do the pieces of their large assignment, and she already had it broken down, but found that a guided practice template for the different pieces of the final paper was helpful for getting them to pay attention to all of those different sections. If-at forms are these scratch-off forms that you can purchase. The library has some that we haven't used in a while, so if you're interested in using those, we can give some out. I find it useful for students to work in a group and they discuss the answer to multiple choice questions. When the group thinks that they know the answer, they scratch off what they think is the answer. And on the scratch off form, if it is the correct answer, they find a star. And if it's not, they know that wasn't the correct answer and keep trying. And because it's a scratch off, it keeps a low-tech record of how many attempts it took for the group to get the right answer. And you can do this individually or you can do this as groups. Jigsaw presentations can be useful where you ask different groups of students to look into some piece of something that they're supposed to be learning, and they learn it in order to share it with the rest of the class. And together, the different groups cover different areas of what needs to be learned, and so it's kind of like a jigsaw. Think, Pair, Share is a really quick and flexible thing that you can do for anything. So give students a moment to think about something, ask them to share it with one person next to them, and then ask groups to share with the whole class. So that helps students develop confidence that they have the right answer before sharing in a larger group. And one of the most basic things that you can do for formative assessment is hold class discussions, and as long as students are actually participating, either verbally or in chat, you can kind of get an idea of where they are in the learning process. So after instruction, there are many examples of things that they can do outside of class. Many of these are research paper focused, but I think that they'll give you an idea of some other things that you can do that maybe aren't related to research papers. So breaking up a big assignment into pieces that are checkpoints with the instructor can be really important. So some examples of those are annotated bibliographies to show that they've been doing some reading and selecting appropriate sources. Drafts in which you give feedback and you expect them to then incorporate that feedback into their final paper. Outlines. Remember that outlines may change over the course of writing if you're looking at the authentic writing processes of experts. But having students show you what their current outline is can be a useful way to see what is going on backstage. Conferences with individual students or with groups to kind of get an idea of where they're at. You can ask them to keep a research process journal. I realize that this is harder to keep on top of, but there are examples in the literature of when this has been successful. You can also have students do some kind of research map. And I believe that some professors on campus have done this successfully. And that can either look like some kind of visual thing or written thing. You can give students some leeway in what exactly is meant by a map. Exit slips are something that students would have to turn in before they leave the class. So show you that they have done something correctly before they leave for the day. 1-minute papers are a short written exercise to just answer a prompt before leaving class. They should be quite short, as in 1 minute, maybe a few minutes, that you can look over and then respond to in the next time that you meet with the students. Peer review of research, where students are getting feedback from each other, can be an effective way. And the research shows that it's not only the feedback they get from other students, it's actually the process of giving feedback that is most valuable for students. You can have students get into the habit of writing questions about things that they still don't understand or would like to know more about and sharing those with you. A lot of these are written, but you can have students make a video recording or sound recording and share that to show what they're learning and what they're doing or thinking about. You can have students write their own review questions for a test. And you can, in other ways, just design check-in points throughout the semester to check in with individual students. Technology can be really helpful, and at this time when we're using a lot more technology than we normally would, that does have some benefits as far as assessment, particularly formative assessment. So clickers and poll everywhere, which we've already talked about. Word clouds, if you want to have students submit a lot of text or those 1-minute papers and reflections, you can feed all of them into a word cloud and it'll have the most commonly used words appear larger. So it's a really fast way to deal with processing a lot of text. You can set up a class blog where students can write comments, which then again just helps you gather the feedback and respond to it more quickly. Google Forms has been really useful for me, so you can use forms to poll students outside of class or in class, and it has some visual ways of aggregating the results so that you can respond to it very quickly. You can create interactive tutorials or create tutorials and lessons in Moodle that have check-in points where students have to do something or answer something that you then see the results of. In Moodle or in Google Forms, you can turn those into quizzes. Turning a Google form into a quiz allows them to get feedback immediately, and I believe Moodle does as well. So as soon as they submit, they can see what their right answers were, and all of that feedback is automated. So those things take a while to set up, but if you have a lot of classes or if you are going to reuse it in future semesters, then the investment in time can save you time in the long run. There are other facilitation tools that you can probably ask other professors about that just help you gather and process student feedback quickly. There is plagiarism detection software, which is often used as summative assessments. However, you can design your assignments so that students turn in drafts and get to see the results so that it can be a formative tool where students learn more about poor paraphrasing and proper citation using Turnitin. And there are location-based assignments. These can be games, so scavenger hunts, and you can design ways for students to prove that they made it to a particular location in some way, whether it's taking a picture, whether it's QR codes, could be GPS, if that's relevant to what you're learning in the class. So as we're talking about formative and summative assessment, now that hopefully I've helped you understand formative assessment a little bit better, I am assuming that you understand summative assessment very well. It's important to remember that the distinction between these is relative. So the students' final papers are summative in the context of the course, yet over time you're likely to change the final paper assignment to improve the assignment so students learn more doing it in future semesters and have an easier time doing it. Also, a final paper may be summative in a class but formative in the curriculum if you're sharing with your department or using those results from a lower level class to inform what you should do in an upper level class. So keep in mind that many assessments may be both formative and summative depending on how you are looking at it. So one thing to keep in mind are students are poor judges of their own learning. This is not meant to be a slight on students. People have done research on this, and I can't find the citations anymore, but there were multiple studies that I found at one point that asked students to write a 1-minute paper, for example, that evaluated their own learning, and then also gave them some kind of assessment to directly show what they learned, and found that the two assessments really didn't line up. This fits in with other research on expertise, and the more you know about a topic, generally the more humble you are of what you still need to learn. But I think that's just part of psychology, is we don't know what we don't know, and we don't see the big picture yet. And it kind of goes along with the phrase, hindsight is 20/20. Many of these students may say after one particular lesson that they learned a lot and this is what they learned, but later in the semester or maybe 10 years down the road, they realize what they actually learned was quite different. Maybe not worse, but quite different than what they thought at the moment. So design your assessments. Don't just ask students if they learned something thinking that that proves that they did learn something, you can ask students if they feel like they've learned something to measure those affective aspects of learning, which can improve motivation and the other affective platforms of cognitive learning. And one of the most important things that I want you to take away from this presentation is to value what you do. I believe that every instructor on Lycoming's campus does these formative assessments, but I also believe, and I've seen at least in the library world, that some people will say, oh, I just don't have time for assessment, or I'm not good at assessment. And those people are not taking into consideration that they do these formative assessments in their classes that don't necessarily leave documentation, but also that raises the issue that there are formative assessment activities that don't naturally leave documentation, but you can make a point of gathering that documentation. And as you start to put together many small formative assessment activities together, you can still build that assessment mosaic that shows what students can do and know. And I want to put a plug in for this book very quickly, Understanding by Design by Wiggins and McTeague. They argue for this idea of backward design, where you start by identifying what you want students to be able to know or do at the end of a lesson, or at the end of a course, or at the end of your curriculum. And then the next step is to determine the acceptable evidence. So the next step is, how will I prove that students have done this? And it's not until you do these two things that you start to think about the details of creating learning experiences and instruction. And I think a lot of professors do this intuitively, but this is a really good book if you want to develop your skills in this area more. And so to finalize this presentation, I want to end with a few basic assessment commandments. I may come up with more over time, but these are just a handful of things that I think are really, really key to doing assessment well. So the first is, don't ask things that you don't want to know. Classroom faculty probably already know this more than librarians, and I'm not saying that about my colleagues at Lycoming. I've spent a lot of time looking at this in the library literature. You, as classroom faculty, already get those end of semester student evaluation forms, which I know can be a very emotional experience. And those are questions that you don't have any control over. But it's important to remember, don't ask, did I do a good job today, if you can't handle students saying no and giving you feedback from their perspective of what you could have done better. Along with that, don't ask for things that you don't care about. If something isn't important to what you want students to walk away from your class knowing or being able to do, then don't ask. And in all honesty, I've seen this in my son's education online, where the questions to hold them accountable for having done an activity really aren't the key of what I know the instructor is asking them to do. And much of this is things that the teacher themselves can't control, but focus your assessments on the things that you as the instructor care about. I highly encourage you to do something with the results. Don't just do assessment because somebody above is telling you that you have to. Design assessments where you actually do something with the results. You might change the assignment the next semester. You might provide more support. You might carve out half of a day to help students with where they're at for their final projects, but make a habit of taking those results and doing something with them to better students' education and better your performance as a professor. So number 4 is a reminder of using student reports of their own learning in the context, keeping in mind that they aren't necessarily good judges. That's not an insult to students. There is a time to ask students for what they learned, but keep that in the context of the research that shows it's not an actual cognitive assessment. Ease into assessment. So that's one of the things that I really love about formative assessment are these can be really small. These can be discussions, then these can be a fist of 5 assessment where you see looks of confusion on their face, so you ask them to hold up their fist, so showing they don't understand this at all, or hold up their hand with all 5 fingers out to show they understand it perfectly, and you can kind of very quickly gauge if you should spend more time on something or if you should move on. It can be that easy and it can also be quite complex. So ease into it. If you don't do a whole lot of formative assessment in your class, or you don't do a whole lot of assessment other than tests, work some of these small things into your class and then add those based on what works for you in your classes. And finally, do what you feel is useful preemptively. So recognizing that I teach differently than you, it is my experience, and it just seems like what I've read in the literature, that as educators, if we do what we find useful to us, then we are less likely to be asked by middle states or by administrators to do things that we might find a lot less useful to our own teaching. So get in the habit of testing out which assessments work for you, and most likely that will work really well for administrators and accrediting bodies as well. So this is the end of this presentation. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have questions, or if you'd like a video on some aspect of this that goes into more detail. I will be happy to support you however I can. Thank you very much for watching.